In the shadows of Navarone's unforgiving streets, a deadly secret lies hidden in plain sight. A former government assassin, now bound to a wheelchair, thought he could bury his past beneath a facade of ordinary life. But when a ruthless gang mistakes his silence for weakness, they unleash something far deadlier than they could have imagined. In a world where appearances deceive, they're about to learn that some predators never lose their fangs. They just wait for the perfect moment to strike. Will his quest for respect cost him the very peace he's fought so hard to find? Stay until the end to discover how this shocking confrontation unfolds. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to never miss another thrilling story of revenge, redemption, and the price we pay for our choices. Now, let's dive into this extraordinary tale. The neon lights of Cindermere District painted eerie shadows across the cracked pavement as Kestrel Voss guided his wheelchair through the familiar turns of Stormweaver's lane. His weathered hands, marked with calluses that told stories he'd rather forget, moved with practiced precision over the wheels. The evening air carried the distant echoes of sirens, a symphony he'd grown accustomed to in this forgotten corner of Navarone. 10 years had passed since he'd traded his sniper rifle for this wheelchair, a constant reminder of his last mission gone wrong. The same hands that once ended lives with surgical precision now helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and fixed children's broken toys. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but it was the peace he'd chosen. His small apartment in Wraith's Edge was modest, nothing like the luxurious safe houses he'd once occupied across the globe. The walls were thin enough to hear his neighbor's television, and the elevator worked only when it felt like it. But it was home, and more importantly, it was anonymous. Here, he wasn't Agent Shadow, the ghost who'd shaped world events from the darkness. He was just the quiet man in 4B who always paid his rent on time. That evening, as the sun bled its last light across the city's jagged skyline, Kestrel noticed something different in the air. The usual groups of teenagers who hung around the corner store were missing, replaced by unfamiliar faces with harder eyes and calculated movements. He'd spent too many years reading body language not to recognize predators marking their territory. The Drez crew, he'd heard them mentioned in whispers. Their leader, Malachi, had been systematically taking over the neighborhood block by block like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue. Until now, they'd left Wraith's Edge alone, perhaps seeing little value in a building full of retirees and minimum wage workers. Kestrel watched them from his peripheral vision, his old instincts humming beneath the surface like a tuned engine ready to roar back to life. Two of them, Cyrus Noct and Theron Wraith, were lounging against a graffitied wall, their eyes following his movement with the lazy interest of vultures spotting potential prey. Evening, Kestrel nodded politely as he passed, playing his role of the harmless disabled man to perfection. Inside, his mind was already mapping their positions, noting the bulge of a weapon under Cyrus's jacket, the way Theron's hand never strayed far from his pocket. "Yeah, evening, old-timer," Cyrus called out, his voice carrying a note of mockery that made Kestrel's fingers twitch with muscle memory. There was a time when such disrespect would have earned them a swift and permanent silence. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He'd buried that man in the same grave as his victims, or so he told himself on the nights when the memories wouldn't let him sleep. The warriors of his past had taught him that true strength lay not in responding to every challenge, but in choosing which battles were worth fighting. As he reached the entrance to Wraith's Edge, the security door's familiar creak was interrupted by quick, light footsteps behind him. Larissa Thael, his next-door neighbor, hurried to catch up, her arms full of art supplies from the community center where she taught. "Let me get that for you, Kestrel," she smiled, holding the door. Her presence was like a splash of color in the building's gray monotony. She never asked about his past, never pushed when his nightmares echoed through the thin walls. Instead, she brought him soup when he was sick and talked to him about her students' latest art projects. "Rough crowd out there tonight," she commented, glancing back at the gang members as the door swung shut. "They've been hanging around more lately. Mrs. Chen from 2A says they've started demanding protection money from the shops on Hollow Path." Kestrel nodded, keeping his expression neutral even as his mind calculated angles and sightlines out of habit. "Everything changes eventually," he said quietly. "The trick is knowing when to adapt and when to stand your ground." They rode the elevator in comfortable silence, But Kestrel's thoughts were already churning. He could feel it in his bones. The peace he'd built was about to be tested. The question wasn't if, but when. And more importantly, who would he choose to be when that moment came? As he wheeled into his apartment that night, Kestrel moved to the window, watching as more of Malachi's crew gathered below. Their laughter carried up through the night air, sharp and predatory. They thought they were the wolves among sheep, never suspecting that something far more dangerous was watching from above. For now, though, he would wait and watch. After all, that's what he'd been trained to do. Patience had always been his deadliest weapon. The following weeks brought a subtle shift to Cindermere District, like the way pressure drops before a storm. Kestrel noticed the changes with the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through countless missions. The Dres crew's presence grew more pronounced, their territory expanding like ink bleeding through paper. It started with small things. The corner store's windows now bore fresh cracks that nobody dared to fix. The elderly couple who ran the laundromat began closing early, their eyes darting nervously at shadows. Even the children's laughter in the small playground across from Wraith's Edge had grown muted, as if the very air had become too heavy to carry joy. Kestrel maintained his routine, wheeling through the neighborhood with practiced indifference. He felt Malachi's men watching him, their gazes growing bolder with each passing day. They were testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses like wolves circling a wounded animal. What they saw was a disabled man, someone who posed no threat to their expanding empire. What they missed were the signs that would have saved their lives in another time. The way his eyes cataloged every movement, how his hands never fumbled despite the uneven pavement, the precise economy of his movements that spoke of years of tactical training. It was a warm evening when everything changed. Kestrel was returning from the small market 3 blocks away, a bag of groceries balanced carefully on his lap. The sun had just begun its descent, painting the city in shades of amber and blood. He noticed Cyrus Nacht and Theron Wraith immediately, along with 2 new faces he recognized as Kieran Vex and Jasper Caney. They were lounging near the entrance to Wraith's Edge, sharing a bottle and paper bags and laughing too loudly. "Well, look who it is," Cyrus called out, his voice carrying the artificial courage of cheap liquor. The neighborhood cripple making his rounds. Kestrel continued forward, his face a mask of calm even as his mind calculated angles, distances, potential weapons. 4 opponents, 2 armed based on their posture, civilian witnesses in at least 3 windows above. In his former life, he could have eliminated them all in under 10 seconds. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man." Cyrus stepped into his path, forcing Kestrel to stop. The others formed a loose circle around him, their grins predatory. The street had suddenly emptied, windows closing one by one as neighbors retreated into the false safety of their homes. "Evening, gentlemen," Kestrel replied, his voice steady and mild. "I'd like to pass, if you don't mind." Theron laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "If you don't mind," he mimicked, drawing snickers from his companions. "Listen to this, proper gentleman." "What's in the bag, proper gentleman?" "Just groceries," Kestrel said, watching as Kieran moved closer, eyeing the bag in his lap. "Nothing of interest to you." "We'll be the judge of that." Cyrus reached for the bag, but Kestrel's hands tightened imperceptibly on the handles. "Come on, old-timer. Consider it a neighborhood tax, for your protection." Protection. The word hung in the air like poison. Kestrel had heard it countless times in his former life, usually before things got messy, before the screaming started. "I don't need protection," he said quietly, each word measured and precise. "Everyone needs protection," Jasper chimed in, cracking his knuckles for emphasis. "Especially someone in your condition." The last word dripped with contempt, and something deep inside Kestrel stirred, a darkness he'd kept carefully caged for years. His fingers twitched, muscle memory recalling the weight of weapons long surrendered. Cyrus must have mistaken his stillness for fear because he grabbed the grocery bag roughly, tearing it from Kestrel's lap. The contents spilled across the sidewalk. Bread, milk, a few cans that rolled into the gutter. One of them burst open, soup spreading across the concrete like arterial spray. The gang members laughed, and Theron gave Kestrel's wheelchair a sharp push that nearly tipped him. "Oops," he sneered. "Better be more careful, proper gentleman." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Streets can be dangerous for people who don't watch their step. Kestrel steadied himself, his eyes never leaving the spilled groceries. He thought of the countless times he'd helped Mrs. Chen carry her shopping, of the children who would wave to him from the playground, of Larissa's quiet companionship. He'd chosen this life, this peace, this neighborhood. He'd buried his old self so deep, he sometimes convinced himself that man was truly dead. But as he watched the soup can rolling in the gutter, something inside him shifted, like a safety being clicked off, like a tripwire being brushed in the dark. "You should go," he said, his voice different now, harder, colder, carrying echoes of empty rooms and last breaths. "While you still can." The gang members exchanged glances, momentarily thrown by the change in his tone, but their own bravado quickly recovered. "Or what?" Cyrus leaned down, his face inches from Kestrel's. "What's a cripple like you going to do about it?" Kestrel finally looked up, and something in his eyes made Cyrus take an involuntary step back. For a brief moment, the mask slipped, and they caught a glimpse of what lurked beneath, something ancient and lethal, a predator they couldn't hope to understand. "That's the question you should be asking yourself," Kestrel said softly. "What am I going to do about it?" The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Theron laughed, breaking the tension. "Come on," he said, already turning away. "Let's leave the proper gentleman to clean up his mess." They swaggered off, shoving each other and laughing, but Kestrel noticed their pace was just a bit too quick, their bravado a touch too forced. They'd seen something in his eyes, even if they didn't understand what it meant. Even predators can sense when they've stumbled across something higher up the food chain. As the sun set over Navarone, Kestrel gathered his spilled groceries with methodical precision, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Above him, a few neighbors peeked out their windows again, their faces painted with a mixture of sympathy and shame. But Kestrel wasn't thinking about them. His mind was already elsewhere, in a locked drawer in his apartment where certain items had waited patiently for years. Items that, like him, had been carefully hidden away but never truly forgotten. The time for peace was over. Now came the hard choices, the ones that would determine not just who he was, but who he would become again. The lock clicked open with practiced ease despite years of disuse. Kestrel sat in his darkened apartment, the drawer's contents spread before him on his worn kitchen table. Moonlight filtered through half-drawn blinds, catching the edges of tools he'd hoped never to touch again. Each item had a history. Each told a story of missions he'd buried in the depths of his memory. A set of lockpicks, worn smooth from countless silent entries. A combat knife with a matte black blade that absorbed light rather than reflected it. 3 burner phones never activated. A small case containing various electronic surveillance equipment. And beneath it all, a false bottom concealing documents, new identities, escape routes, safe house locations. The insurance policy of a man who never truly believed he could leave his past behind. "Is this really what you want to do?" Larissa's voice drifted through his thoughts. She had caught him in the hallway earlier, helping him pick up the last of his scattered groceries. Her eyes had been full of concern, but there was something else there too. Recognition, perhaps, of the change taking place within him. Kestrel's hands moved over the equipment, muscle memory taking over as he checked each item. The familiar routine brought with it a flood of memories. Rain-slicked rooftops in Bangkok, snow-covered alleys in Moscow, the suffocating heat of Dubai's endless nights. Each city, each mission, each target had required perfect planning, flawless execution. But this was different. This wasn't a government-sanctioned hit or a classified operation. This was personal, and personal meant dangerous. Personal meant emotional. And emotion, as his handlers had drilled into him countless times, was a killer's worst enemy. He wheeled himself to the window, watching the street below. Malachi's crew had grown bolder in the past few hours, their numbers swelling as news of the confrontation spread. They were marking their territory, sending a message. To them, this was just another show of force, another step in their takeover of the neighborhood. They couldn't know they were being watched by eyes that had once guided precision strikes and coordinated black ops across 3 continents. Kestrel observed their patterns, noting shift changes, identifying hierarchies, mapping their movements. Old habits surfaced with frightening ease, like a language he'd never truly forgotten. Cyrus and Theron were middle management at best, strutting peacocks who relied on numbers and intimidation. The real threat was Malachi Drez himself, who rarely appeared but whose influence was felt everywhere. Intelligence suggested he operated from the Ashen Mill, the abandoned factory that served as their base of operations. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Through the peephole, he saw Larissa standing in the hallway, shifting nervously from foot to foot. For a moment, he considered not answering, but something in her posture spoke of urgency. "They're downstairs," she said as soon as he opened the door. "They're demanding protection money from everyone in the building. Mrs. Chen. They hurt her when she said she couldn't pay." Kestrel's jaw tightened. Mrs. Chen, who saved fortune cookies from her takeout orders to give to the neighborhood kids, who fed stray cats despite barely having enough to feed herself. How bad? Bad enough. Her grandson took her to the hospital. Larissa wrung her hands. "Kestrel, I know you're not. I mean, I've always sensed there's more to you than..." She struggled to find the words. "These people, they're not going to stop." "No," he agreed quietly. "They're not." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "When you were in the military..." "I wasn't military," he interrupted. The words came out before he could stop them, sharp and final. Larissa fell silent, processing this. Then, carefully, "Whatever you were, whatever you did, the neighborhood needs someone to stand up to them, but standing up might mean... It might mean becoming someone I promised myself I'd never be again," Kestrel finished. He looked at her directly, letting her see the weight of the decision in his eyes. "Are you sure you want to encourage that?" She met his gaze steadily. "I want my students to be able to walk to the community center without fear. I want Mrs. Chen to feel safe in her own shop. I want..." She gestured helplessly at the building around them. "I want our home back. Our home." The words echoed in Kestrel's mind. When had this place become home? When had these people, Larissa with her art classes, Mrs. Chen with her fortune cookies, the kids who waved from the playground, become more than just part of his cover? "If I do this," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Not just for me, but for everyone. Things will change. People will get hurt. Some might die." "Haven't people already been hurt?" Larissa challenged. "Isn't Mrs. Chen in the hospital right now? How long before it's someone else, someone younger, more vulnerable?" The truth of her words hung in the air between them. Kestrel wheeled himself back slightly, creating distance. "You should go, whatever happens next. It's better if you're not involved." Larissa nodded, understanding the dismissal for what it was. But at the door, she paused. "Just remember something. The man you're afraid of becoming. Maybe he's exactly who we need right now." After she left, Kestrel returned to the table where his past lay spread out like a roadmap to violence. He picked up the combat knife, testing its balance. The weight was familiar, comfortable, like shaking hands with an old friend who shared too many dark secrets. His decision had been made the moment they pushed his chair, he realized. Everything since then, the equipment check, the surveillance, even this conversation with Larissa, had just been his methodical mind preparing for the inevitable. Across the street, one of Malachi's men lit a cigarette, its ember glowing like a tiny star in the darkness. Soon, very soon, they would learn what it meant to mistake patience for weakness, to confuse peace with helplessness. The predator they had awakened was nothing like the thugs they were used to dealing with. He was something else entirely, a ghost, a shadow, a nightmare they hadn't known to fear. and as Kestrel began his preparations in earnest, a small part of him wondered if he was really protecting the neighborhood, or if he was simply surrendering to the darkness he'd spent years trying to escape. The next 3 days transformed Cindermere District into a chessboard in Kestrel's mind. Every street corner became a potential ambush point, every alleyway a tactical advantage waiting to be exploited. He wheeled through his usual routes, playing the role of the harmless disabled man, while his trained eyes cataloged every detail of Malachi's operation. Kieran Vex was the weakest link, young, eager to prove himself, and most importantly, careless. He had a habit of taking smoke breaks alone behind the Eclipse Tavern, always around midnight when the bar's back door would clang shut for final deliveries. The sound would mask any unexpected noises, and the flickering security light created perfect shadows for what Kestrel had planned. "You've been quiet lately," Larissa commented that evening, catching him as he checked his mailbox. Her eyes held questions she didn't voice, but Kestrel could see she understood something was coming. "The whole building feels like it's holding its breath." "Sometimes quiet is good," he replied, noting how 2 of Malachi's newer recruits watched them from across the street. "Sometimes it means change is coming." She nodded, then hesitated. "Mrs. Chen came back from the hospital today. They broke 3 of her fingers, Kestrel. 3 fingers just to send a message." His expression didn't change, but something cold and familiar stirred in his chest. In his former life, he'd broken fingers too, not for money or territory, but for information that saved lives, prevented attacks, protected assets. He'd told himself it was different, justified. Now he wondered if those distinctions mattered anymore. As midnight approached, Kestrel positioned himself in the shadows near the Eclipse Tavern. He'd modified his wheelchair over the past days. Silent wheels, reinforced frame, concealed compartments. Even the squeaky right armrest that had annoyed him for years now served a purpose, hiding a spring-loaded blade mechanism. Right on schedule, the bar's back door clanged shut, and Kieran Vex emerged fishing for his cigarettes. The young gang member was humming to himself, riding high on the power trip of their recent activities. He didn't notice the silent wheelchair approaching until Kestrel's voice cut through the darkness. "Those things will kill you," Kestrel said softly, emerging from the shadows, though probably not as quickly as other things. Kieran spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon in his waistband. "What the fu—" The blade shot from Kestrel's armrest with a whisper, finding its mark in Kieran's right thigh. The young man's cry of pain was muffled by Kestrel's hand, practiced fingers finding pressure points that turned sound into silence. "Listen carefully," Kestrel whispered, his voice carrying the chill of countless interrogations. "I'm going to ask you questions about Malachi's operation. Blink once for yes, twice for no. If you try to lie to me." He twisted the blade slightly, drawing a muffled whimper. "I know exactly how much pain a human body can endure before losing consciousness, and I never let them lose consciousness." What followed was a masterclass in information extraction. Kestrel's questions were precise, targeted. Guard rotations at the Ashen Mill, weapon caches, payment schedules. With each answer, he built a clearer picture of Malachi's empire and its vulnerabilities. "Last question," Kestrel said, after learning everything he needed. "Do you understand what happens if you tell anyone about our conversation?" Kieran's eyes, wide with terror, blinked once. "Good." Kestrel removed the blade with surgical precision, immediately applying pressure to prevent serious blood loss. "The wound is shallow. You'll limp for a few days, but nothing permanent. Consider it a reminder of our chat." He left Kieran slumped against the wall, shaking and pale but very much alive. It wasn't mercy. In Kestrel's experience, a wounded messenger delivered fear more effectively than a dead one. Returning to Wraith's Edge, Kestrel noticed how the night seemed different now. The darkness felt familiar again, comfortable, like an old coat he'd never quite given away. Part of him was troubled by how easily he'd slipped back into his old methods, while another part recognized the bitter truth. This was who he was, who he'd always been. The peaceful neighbor routine had been the real pretense. In his apartment, he began mapping out the intelligence he'd gathered. Malachi's operation was larger than he'd initially estimated, with connections to several other districts. The Ashen Mill wasn't just a base, it was a fortress, with multiple escape routes and armed guards working in rotating shifts. A soft tap at his window made him freeze. On the fire escape, barely visible in the darkness, sat a black cat, one of Mrs. Chen's strays. It watched him with luminous eyes that seemed to hold neither judgment nor approval. "We all have to be what we are," Kestrel told it quietly, remembering something one of his old handlers used to say. "The trick is making sure we're the right monster for the right moment." The cat blinked slowly and disappeared into the night, leaving Kestrel alone with his plans and the weight of his decisions. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Kieran's information would help him dismantle Malachi's operation piece by piece, but he had to move carefully. One wrong step, and the predator could become prey. As he wheeled himself to bed, Kestrel caught his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him wasn't the quiet neighbor who fixed toys and helped with groceries. This was Agent Shadow, the ghost who had terrorized terrorists, the nightmare that kept other nightmares awake at night. And somewhere in the city, in the depths of the Ashen Mill, Malachi Drez had no idea that his empire was about to face something far deadlier than any street gang. A man with nothing left to lose, except the very soul he'd spent years trying to save. The news spread through Malachi's organization like a virus. Kieran's story, carefully edited to protect himself, painted a picture of a shadow that struck without warning. Some dismissed it as the imagination of a rookie who'd had too much to drink, but others noticed the change in him. The cocky young gangster who enjoyed roughing up shopkeepers now flinched at sudden movements and avoided the Eclipse Tavern's back alley like it was cursed. In the Ashen Mill, Malachi Drez paced the floor of his office, a converted foreman's room that overlooked the factory floor below. The space reeked of stale cigarettes and tension as his lieutenants delivered their reports. "Someone's targeting our operations," Cyrus Nacht explained, struggling to keep his voice steady under Malachi's intense gaze. "The drop-off point on Stormweaver's lane was compromised. We found Ricky unconscious, our product gone. He says he never saw who hit him." Malachi stopped pacing, his scarred fingers drumming against the dusty windowsill. And now Kieran's jumping at shadows, all within days of that incident with the man in the wheelchair. He turned to face his lieutenants, his eyes cold. "Tell me that's not a coincidence." Meanwhile, across the district, Kestrel was implementing the next phase of his plan. The intelligence from Kieran had provided him with a complete picture of Malachi's distribution network. Like any predator, he would weaken his prey before the kill, cutting off their resources, isolating them from their support system. He wheeled through the morning crowds, a ghost hiding in plain sight. His chair now carried additional modifications, reinforced wheel spokes that could support his weight in ways the gang would never expect, hidden compartments containing tools of his trade. Every rotation of the wheels brought him closer to his next target. The morning sun cast long shadows across Hollow Path as he approached one of Malachi's lookouts, a teenager named Miguel, who was supposed to warn the others if police or rival gangs entered their territory. The boy was absorbed in his phone, earbuds drowning out the world around him. Amateur. Kestrel positioned himself carefully, timing his move with the passing of a delivery truck. Its rumbling engine masked the sound of his approach, and by the time Miguel looked up, it was too late. "Your mother works at the hospital, doesn't she?" Kestrel's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Night shift in the pediatric ward. It would be shame if anything happened to her on those long walks home." The boy's face went pale. How did you—" "I know everything about Malachi's operation," Kestrel continued, his wheelchair blocking Miguel's escape route, "including how he recruits kids like you with promises of easy money. But here's what he didn't tell you. I'm giving you a choice your friends didn't get. Walk away now, find a real job, and your mother never needs to know how close you came to ruining your life. Stay and—" He let the silence fill in the rest. Miguel was young enough to be scared but smart enough to recognize an escape route when he saw one. He nodded quickly, pulled out his phone, and sent a quick text, presumably quitting the gang, before hurrying away without looking back. One more piece removed from the board. Kestrel had spent the night mapping out similar pressure points throughout Malachi's organization. Many of his soldiers were like Miguel, young, scared, involved more from circumstance than conviction. They just needed the right motivation to abandon ship. Back at Wraith's Edge, Larissa caught him near the mailboxes again. "Things are different today," she said quietly, pretending to sort through her mail. "Malachi's men seem nervous. They're traveling in larger groups, watching their backs." "Fear has a way of changing people's habits," Kestrel replied, noting how the usual gang members who loitered near the building were indeed missing. "Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it makes them dangerous. Like cornered animals?" There was worry in her voice. "No," Kestrel's eyes darkened. "Cornered animals are predictable. Cornered humans with wounded pride are something else entirely." He was proven right that evening. As darkness fell over Cindermere District, multiple fires broke out simultaneously across the neighborhood. Small ones strategically placed to spread fear rather than cause serious damage. It was Malachi's response, a message that two could play at this game. From his window, Kestrel watched the fire trucks arrive, their sirens painting the night in red and blue. He'd anticipated this reaction. Malachi was trying to demonstrate power, to show that he could touch everyone in the district. But in doing so, he'd made a crucial mistake. The fires had forced his men to move, to break their usual patterns. Through his scope, Kestrel tracked their movements, noting new faces, identifying command structures. Each emergency response revealed another layer of Malachi's organization. A soft knock at his door interrupted his surveillance. It was Mrs. Chen, her bandaged hand cradled against her chest. "Mr. Voss," she said quietly. "May I come in?" He wheeled back, allowing her to enter. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Things are changing," she said, settling into his worn armchair. "The men who hurt me, I saw them today. They looked afraid." She studied his face carefully. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Kestrel met her gaze steadily. "Sometimes people who enjoy causing fear need to be reminded what it feels like." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, then reached into her pocket with her good hand. She pulled out a small key. "The back door of my shop," she explained. "It connects to the alley network behind Hollow Path. Might be useful for someone who needs to move quietly." He stared at the key, understanding the weight of what she was offering. Not just access, but trust, support, complicity. "The neighborhood remembers kindness," she continued, placing the key on his table. "But it also remembers justice." With that, she stood and walked to the door, pausing only to add, "Whatever you're doing, be careful. But don't stop." After she left, Kestrel turned the key over in his hands, thinking about choices and consequences. The neighborhood was choosing sides, drawing lines in the sand. Tomorrow, Malachi would discover that several more of his operators had disappeared, melted away into the night. The fires were meant to demonstrate his power, but they had only revealed his desperation. In the distance, another siren wailed, and Kestrel allowed himself a grim smile. Let them burn their warnings into the night. He would show them what real fear looked like, not with flames and chaos, but with precision and purpose. The kind of fear that comes from knowing that somewhere in the darkness, something is hunting you, and all your power, all your threats, mean nothing against its patient, inevitable approach. The Ashen Mill erupted in chaos as Malachi Drez hurled a chair across his office, the crash echoing through the cavernous building. His remaining lieutenants stood in uncomfortable silence as their leader's composure finally cracked. 23! Malachi's voice carried the edge of barely controlled rage. 23 of our people gone in 3 days. Some disappeared, others suddenly found their conscience. He turned to face his diminishing inner circle, his eyes blazing. And no one, not one of you, can tell me who's responsible? Theron Wraith shifted nervously, his usual bravado diminished by recent events. We've doubled the patrols, set up additional surveillance, and yet, Malachi cut him off. This ghost continues to tear apart everything we've built. He moved to the window, watching his remaining men scurrying about below like ants sensing an approaching storm. Tell me about the wheelchair man again. Cyrus stepped forward, clearing his throat. We checked his background. Kestrel Voss moved to Cindermere District 4 years ago. No criminal record, no military service we could find. Just another disabled resident. Number Malachi's voice was quiet now, more dangerous. No one just anything makes my people vanish like smoke. No ordinary man makes hardened criminals quit with just a conversation. He turned back to his lieutenants. Find out who he really is, whatever it takes. Across the district, Kestrel was conducting his own preparation for the inevitable escalation. He knew Malachi would eventually connect the dots, if he hadn't already. The gang leader's response to that realization would determine the next phase of their deadly dance. In his apartment, Kestrel had transformed his living room into a command center. Maps of the district covered one wall, marked with patrol routes, safe houses, and escape paths. Mrs. Chen's key had already proved invaluable, providing access to a network of interconnected alleyways that let him move unseen throughout the neighborhood. He was cleaning his modified wheelchair when Larissa's distinct knock interrupted his work. Opening the door, he found her looking more troubled than usual. "They're asking questions about you," she said without preamble, stepping inside. "Men I've never seen before. They were at the community center, showing your picture, offering money for information." Kestrel nodded, unsurprised. It was bound to happen. Malachi's not stupid. Desperate now, but not stupid. They had guns, Kestrel. Not hidden like usual. Displayed openly. They want people to see them. She hugged herself, a gesture of unconscious anxiety. "It feels like we're heading towards something terrible." "We are," he agreed, wheeling back to his workbench. "But terrible things were already happening. The difference is now they're happening to them instead of us." Larissa watched him work for a moment, noting the precise movements of his hands as he adjusted something beneath his wheelchair's armrest. "You're not just fighting them, are you? You're dismantling them, piece by piece." "It's what I was trained to do," he replied, not looking up. "Identify the structure, find the weak points, apply pressure until it collapses. And when it collapses, what happens to everyone caught in the debris?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Kestrel finally looked up, meeting her concerned gaze. "That's why precision matters. Minimal collateral damage, maximum impact." A commotion outside drew them both to the window. On the street below, a group of Malachi's men were conducting a very public beating, not of a rival or a debtor, but of one of their own. The message was clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated. "They're getting scared," Larissa whispered, watching the brutal display. "Scared people do terrible things." "Yes," Kestrel agreed, his mind already calculating how to use their fear against them. "But scared people also make mistakes." As if to prove his point, the gang members below were being sloppy, drawing attention, breaking their own protocols. Their show of force was really a show of weakness, and Kestrel intended to exploit every crack in their crumbling facade. Later that night, after Larissa had left, Kestrel made his move. Using the intelligence he'd gathered, he identified the gang's main money collection route. Every night, 2 armed men would visit their protected businesses, gathering the day's payments before delivering them to the Ashen Mill. Tonight's collectors were new, replacements for men who had mysteriously disappeared or abruptly quit. They were nervous, jumpy, and most importantly, untrained. Perfect. Kestrel tracked them from the shadows, using the alley network to stay parallel to their route. The first collector nearly wet himself when Kestrel emerged from the darkness ahead of them, his wheelchair silent on the newly oiled wheels. "Evening, gentlemen." His voice carried the chill of a morgue. "I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you." The second collector reached for his gun, but Kestrel was already moving. His modified wheelchair spun with practiced precision as a blade shot from its frame, finding its mark in the man's shoulder. Before the first collector could react, something whistled through the air, striking his temple with calculated force, enough to stun, not kill. Within seconds, both men were unconscious, their collection money now in Kestrel's possession. But he wasn't interested in the money. This was about sending a message. He placed a single playing card, the ace of spades, the death card, on each man's chest. By morning, the story would spread. A ghost in a wheelchair, moving like shadow, striking like death itself. The fear would grow, and with it, Malachi's control would continue to unravel. But as Kestrel wheeled back toward Wraith's edge, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Multiple figures, moving with purpose rather than panic. They weren't Malachi's usual thugs. These men moved differently, professionally. Mercenaries. Malachi was bringing in outside help. The game was changing. The stakes were rising. And somewhere in the night, a predator and his prey were about to discover that the line between hunter and hunted was thinner than either had imagined. Dawn painted Cindermere District in shades of gray, as Kestrel observed the newcomers through his modified scope. They moved differently from Malachi's usual muscle. Disciplined, coordinated, scanning sight lines and maintaining tactical spacing. He counted 6 of them, all carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military training. One in particular caught his attention. A tall, lean figure with a distinctive gait that suggested Eastern European special forces. The way he constantly checked his 3 and 9 positions, the subtle hand signals he used to direct the others. This was their leader. Interesting choice, Malachi, Kestrel murmured to himself, watching the mercenaries establish their patrol patterns. But you should have hired more. A soft knock interrupted his surveillance. Through the peephole, he saw Larissa, her face drawn with worry. When he opened the door, she rushed in, speaking in hurried whispers. "They're searching apartments," she said, pacing his small living room. "Building by building. Professional-looking men with foreign accents. They say they're building inspectors, but building inspectors don't carry concealed Sig Sauers or wear tactical boots," Kestrel finished, already moving to his workbench. "How close?" "2 buildings down." "Kestrel, these men. They're not like the others. The way they move, the way they search, it's methodical. They know what they're doing." "Yes," he agreed, reaching beneath his wheelchair to activate several hidden mechanisms. Finally, some proper opposition. Larissa stared at him. "You're enjoying this?" "No," he corrected, checking the spring-loaded blade in his armrest. "But I respect it. Malachi's raising the stakes. Bringing in professionals means he's desperate. But it also means he's thinking strategically now. The game is evolving." "This isn't a game." Larissa's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. "People's lives are at stake." "Games are all about stakes," Kestrel replied, his voice taking on the cold precision she'd begun to recognize as his operative tone. "And these men understand the rules better than Malachi's thugs. They'll be more careful, more precise, less collateral damage." A commotion from the street drew them to the window. The mercenaries had cornered one of Malachi's former collectors, a young man who'd quit after Kestrel's nighttime visit. The professionals formed a loose circle around him, their leader stepping forward to ask questions in accented English. "They're gathering intelligence," Kestrel observed, "building a profile. These men are hunters, not just muscle." "What are you going to do?" "Spring the trap before it's fully set." He turned to Larissa. "I need you to do something for me. Something that puts you at risk." She met his gaze steadily. "Tell me." Over the next hour, as the mercenaries methodically worked their way through the neighboring buildings, Kestrel set his plan in motion. Larissa left his apartment carrying a sealed envelope, her steps carefully unhurried as she made her way to the community center. The leader of the mercenaries noticed her immediately, exactly as Kestrel had predicted. 2 of his men peeled off to follow her while the others continued their search. The envelope she carried was obviously bait, but they couldn't risk ignoring it. Meanwhile, Kestrel accessed the alley network through Mrs. Chen's shop, moving silently through the shadows. He knew professional soldiers would expect misdirection, which is why his true purpose had nothing to do with Larissa or the envelope. While the mercenaries' attention was split, he made his way to their temporary base, a recently acquired apartment 3 blocks away. The lock was professional grade, but picked easily enough by hands that had never truly forgotten their trade. Inside, he found what he expected: communications equipment, surveillance feeds, tactical maps. But more importantly, he found their files. dossiers on local gang members, suspected associates, and potential targets. Intelligence was the true currency of modern warfare, and Kestrel had just raided their bank. He photographed everything methodically, paying special attention to their operational protocols and communication codes. Then, with practiced efficiency, he made subtle alterations to their equipment, nothing obvious enough to detect immediately, but enough to sow confusion when they needed reliability most. A burst of chatter from their radio indicated the team following Larissa had secured the envelope. Inside, they would find exactly what Kestrel intended: a series of coordinates leading to various dead drops around the district, each containing another clue. A wild goose chase designed to waste their time and resources while revealing their methods. Exiting the apartment, Kestrel allowed himself a grim smile. The mercenaries were good, perhaps even very good, but they were fighting on his territory now. More importantly, they were fighting his kind of war: shadows, deception, and the careful manipulation of perception. Back in his apartment, he found Larissa waiting. "They took the bait," she reported. Very professionally, I might add. No threats, no violence, just a polite "excuse me" before they relieved me of the envelope. Professional courtesy. Kestrel nodded, already reviewing the photos he'd taken. They'll spend the next few days chasing ghosts while I learn their patterns. By the time they realize the hunt is leading nowhere, I'll know everything about them. And then I start hunting the hunters. He looked up at her. These men are soldiers for hire. They fight for money, not loyalty. Once they realize their employer has drawn them into a fight they can't win, they'll do what professionals do: cut their losses and withdraw. A sudden burst of gunfire in the distance made them both tense. The sound was different from the usual gang weapons: controlled bursts, military precision. Testing response times, Kestrel explained. They're mapping police patterns, emergency service routes, building a complete tactical picture of the neighborhood. "Like you did," Larissa observed. "Yes, but they're doing it obviously, wanting to be seen, which means what? Which means there's something else happening that they don't want anyone to notice." Kestrel wheeled to his map wall, studying the patterns with fresh eyes. "The question isn't what they're doing, it's what they're distracting us from." The pieces were starting to come together in his mind. Malachi hadn't just hired mercenaries for their skills, he'd hired them for their ability to command attention. They were the visible threat, the obvious danger. But somewhere in the shadows, something else was stirring. And Kestrel had a feeling that before this was over, he'd discover exactly what Malachi was really planning. 3 days of watching the mercenaries chase shadows had revealed a pattern that troubled Kestrel's tactical instincts. Their movements were too obvious, their presence too theatrical. These were men trained in covert operations, yet they were deliberately drawing attention to themselves. In his apartment, surrounded by surveillance photos and tactical maps, Kestrel pieced together the puzzle. The mercenaries' patrol routes created a very specific pattern. They were systematically pushing residents away from certain areas of the district while maintaining high visibility in others. "They're hurting us," he muttered, marking another location on his map. The realization struck him like a physical blow, creating blind spots. A knock at his door interrupted his analysis. Through the peephole, he saw Mrs. Chen, clutching a paper bag from her shop. He let her in, noting the tension in her movements. "Green tea," she said, placing the bag on his table. "Good for clarity of thought, and..." She lowered her voice. "Information. The men in tactical gear. They've been asking about the old subway tunnels." Kestrel's eyes narrowed. The abandoned subway network beneath Cindermere District had been sealed off decades ago, its entrances buried under urban development. What exactly do they want to know? Access points, maintenance tunnels, old station locations. Mrs. Chen's fingers nervously traced the bandages that still wrapped her injured hand. "My husband worked maintenance down there before they closed it. They offered me money for his old maps." The pieces clicked into place, while the mercenaries commanded everyone's attention above ground. Something else was happening below. Kestrel wheeled to his computer, pulling up city planning documents he'd archived years ago as part of his standard territory reconnaissance. The tunnels, he explained, bringing up a schematic. They run directly beneath the ashen mill, don't they? Mrs. Chen nodded. There was a maintenance station there, when it was still a working factory. The tunnel networks connect to 3 other districts, perfect for moving products, or people, undetected. While everyone watched the mercenaries' show of force above ground, Malachi was establishing underground supply lines. But why now? Why such an elaborate distraction? Unless… Mrs. Chen, Kestrel turned to her sharply. When did they first ask about the tunnels? 2 days ago, right after the city announced the new police funding for district patrols. And there it was. The police were planning to increase their presence in Cindermere, so Malachi was going underground, literally. The mercenaries weren't just a response to Kestrel's attacks. They were part of a larger strategy to maintain control of the territory, even under increased law enforcement scrutiny. Clever, Kestrel admitted. Use professionals to establish a visible presence while building invisible infrastructure. When the police increase their patrols, the mercenaries withdraw, leaving no obvious criminal activity to investigate. Meanwhile, everything continues smoothly underground. Mrs. Chen watched him process this information, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The tea shop on Hollow Path, she said quietly. Its basement used to connect to the maintenance tunnels. My husband sealed it himself, but the access is still there, behind the old storage shelves. Kestrel nodded, understanding the gift she was offering. Thank you. You should go now. The less you know about what happens next, the safer you'll be. After she left, Kestrel began modifying his plans. The mercenaries were a formidable distraction, but now he understood they were exactly that, a distraction. The real target was below ground. He spent the next hours studying the tunnel schematics, marking choke points and potential ambush locations. The underground network was a double-edged sword. It offered Malachi's operation protection from surface surveillance, but it also created perfect killing grounds for someone who knew how to use confined spaces to their advantage. As night fell, Kestrel prepared his equipment with methodical precision. His wheelchair had been modified for silent operation in the tunnels. Rubber-coated wheels, reinforced frame, additional weapon mounts. He packed light amplification gear and several specially designed charges that could collapse key tunnel sections if necessary. A soft tap at his window announced Larissa's arrival via the fire escape. They're changing patterns, she reported, slipping inside. The mercenaries are concentrating their patrols around specific blocks, creating dead zones in others. They're securing their supply routes, Kestrel explained, showing her the tunnel map. Everything we've seen above ground has been theater, professional smoke and mirrors to hide what's happening below. Larissa studied the map, her artist's eye quickly grasping the pattern. These tunnels could let them control the entire district without ever being seen. Exactly, which is why I need to shut them down before they're fully operational. He turned to her, his expression grave. Tomorrow, things escalate. The mercenaries are trained professionals. When I strike their underground operation, they'll respond with everything they have. The neighborhood could become a battlefield. It already is. The difference is, after tomorrow, the battle moves into the open. He wheeled to his window, watching the mercenaries' patrol lights sweep the streets below. I need you to help coordinate with Mrs. Chen and the others. When things start happening, people need to stay inside, away from windows. The professionals will try to minimize civilian casualties, but Malachi's regular crew might not be so careful. Larissa nodded, understanding the weight of what was coming. Just come back, okay? The neighborhood needs you, not just for this fight, but for whatever comes after. Kestrel didn't respond immediately, his mind already cycling through combat scenarios and contingency plans. Finally, he said, "Sometimes the only way out is through. Tomorrow, we go through." As Larissa left, Kestrel returned to his preparations. The mercenaries were good, but they'd made a critical mistake. They'd assumed they were hunting a crippled vigilante, not a professional operative with decades of experience. Tomorrow, they'd learn the difference. In the distance, a police siren wailed briefly before falling silent. Above ground, the mercenaries continued their patrol theater. unaware that their carefully orchestrated distraction had become a vulnerability. Below ground, Malachi's dream of an underground empire was about to become a nightmare. The abandoned tea shop on Hollow Path still smelled faintly of jasmine and dust. Kestrel moved silently through the darkness, his modified wheelchair making no sound on the old wooden floors. The basement access creaked slightly as he used a custom lift system he'd installed hours earlier. Preparation, as always, was key to survival. The underground tunnel network spread before him like a giant spider web, its concrete arteries stretching into darkness. His night vision equipment painted everything in shades of green, revealing decades of abandonment. But there were fresh marks on the ground, recent activity that turned the abandoned tunnels into crucial infrastructure for Malachi's operation. "Command tunnel access achieved," a voice echoed from somewhere ahead, one of the mercenaries reporting in. Kestrel smiled grimly. Their radio discipline was good, but sound carried differently underground. He'd mapped the acoustic patterns during his reconnaissance, turning the tunnel's echo into a tactical advantage. Moving deeper into the network, Kestrel noticed fresh installation work, power lines, security cameras, modern ventilation. Malachi had been busy, turning this forgotten underground maze into a sophisticated operation. But sophisticated meant vulnerable, especially to someone who understood infrastructure targeting. The first group of guards never saw him coming. Two of Malachi's regular thugs, clearly uncomfortable in the tunnel environment, were playing cards near a newly installed electrical junction. Kestrel's first strike took out the lights. His second and third ensured they wouldn't raise an alarm. "Watch positions 4 and 7, possible power fluctuation," another mercenary voice crackled over their comms. They were professional enough to be suspicious, but not yet alarmed. That would change soon. Kestrel planted his first charge at a crucial intersection, carefully calculating the blast radius. When detonated, it would collapse this section of the tunnel without compromising the structural integrity of the buildings above. He'd learned long ago that precision was just as important in demolition as it was in elimination. Moving deeper into the network, he encountered more signs of Malachi's expansion. Crates of weapons, drugs, and what appeared to be human trafficking documentation. The operation was larger than even he had suspected. This wasn't just about controlling one district. This was about establishing an underground empire in the most literal sense. A patrol of mercenaries approached his position, 3 men moving with professional caution, checking corners with tactical lights. Kestrel retreated into a maintenance alcove, his wheelchair's dark coating blending perfectly with the shadows. They passed within feet of his position, their lights sweeping past him. "Section C clear," one reported into his radio. "Moving to check the power junction." Kestrel waited until they were 20 meters ahead before moving. His first projectile, a modified dart fired from his chair's hidden compartment, took out their rear guard silently. The second found its mark in the point man's neck before he could turn. The leader spun around, his reaction time impressive, but Kestrel's blade was faster. "Section C, report status," the radio crackled, when no response came. "All units, possible compromise in Section C. Implement Protocol 7. The tunnels came alive with activity. Emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in harsh red illumination. Steel doors began sliding shut at key intersections, a lockdown protocol designed to contain threats. But Kestrel had already anticipated this. During his earlier reconnaissance, he'd sabotaged key door mechanisms. Instead of sealing the tunnels, the lockdown actually isolated the mercenary teams from each other, breaking their defensive coordination. "Multiple sections losing power," a panicked voice reported over the comms. "Camera systems down in sections D through F. Hold positions," the mercenary commander's accented voice cut through the chatter. "He's hunting us, maintain unit integrity," and the rest was lost as Kestrel triggered his first charge. The explosion was precisely controlled, but in the enclosed space, it sounded like the end of the world. The shockwave rippled through the tunnel network, followed by the rumble of collapsing concrete. Using the confusion, Kestrel moved deeper into the complex. His real target wasn't the mercenaries, or even the tunnel network. It was the documentation he'd spotted earlier. Evidence of Malachi's entire operation, enough to ensure that even if they survived this night, they'd have nowhere to rebuild. A burst of gunfire erupted ahead. Mercenaries shooting at shadows, their professional discipline cracking under the pressure of an unseen enemy who seemed to be everywhere at once. Kestrel used their fire to mask his movement, placing more charges at structural weak points. "He's in the main storage section," someone shouted, followed by more gunfire. Wrong direction, exactly as he'd planned. While they converged on a phantom threat, Kestrel accessed the records room. Inside, he found more than he'd expected. Not just operational documents, but evidence of corruption reaching into City Hall, police departments, and other districts. Malachi hadn't just been building an underground physical infrastructure. He'd been building a network of influence that could survive any surface-level crackdown. "Clever," Kestrel muttered, photographing everything with quick efficiency. But not clever enough. A new sound echoed through the tunnels. Heavy boots, lots of them, moving with purpose. Malachi was sending in his regular force, probably through multiple access points. They lacked the mercenaries' training, but they made up for it with numbers and familiarity with the tunnel layout. Kestrel triggered his second set of charges, strategically placed to drive both forces, mercenaries and gang members, toward a central junction. Professional soldiers and street thugs, forced together in a confined space, each expecting a different type of threat. The chaos would be spectacular. As if on cue, confused shouting and sporadic gunfire erupted from that direction. In the tight confines of the tunnels with minimal visibility and frayed nerves, the two forces were engaging each other. "All units, hold fire!" The mercenary commander's voice was losing its professional edge. "Unknown friendlies in the sector. I repeat." Kestrel's third set of charges cut off the transmission. Not explosives this time, but carefully placed smoke devices, filling key sections of the tunnel with dense, disorienting clouds. In the confusion, he made his way toward his exit point, leaving behind a trail of strategic demolition charges that would seal this underground network permanently. But as he approached his extraction route, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Malachi himself, somewhere in the tunnel complex. The gang leader had come underground personally, probably to secure sensitive materials or oversee the response to the attack. Kestrel paused, calculating. His mission was technically complete. He had the evidence needed to dismantle Malachi's operation, and the charges were set to destroy his infrastructure. The logical move would be to withdraw now. But sometimes, logic wasn't enough. The tunnels had become a labyrinth of smoke, gunfire, and confusion. Through his night vision gear, Kestrel tracked Malachi's movement. The gang leader was moving with surprising competence, accompanied by two mercenaries who'd clearly been assigned as his personal security detail. They were heading toward a secondary command center, one that Kestrel's earlier reconnaissance had identified but left intentionally untouched. "Find him!" Malachi's voice carried a note of barely controlled fury. "I want his head, I want—" "Sir," one of the mercenaries cut in, professional even now. "We need to evacuate. The structural damage— This is my territory." Malachi's response echoed off the concrete walls. "Underground, above ground, it's all mine. I won't let some crippled vigilante take it from me." Kestrel moved silently through the chaos, his wheelchair's modified wheels gliding over the uneven ground. The smoke provided perfect cover, and the ongoing conflicts between the mercenaries and gang members had created multiple diversions. But he knew time was running out. The demolition charges were set on a timer, and the tunnel's integrity was already compromised. A burst of gunfire erupted to his left, more mercenaries engaging shadows in the smoke. Their professional discipline was cracking, fear and confusion replacing tactical precision. To his right, he heard Malachi's gang members shooting wildly at anything that moved. The tunnel system had become a pressure cooker of panic and violence. Through it all, Kestrel moved with deadly purpose. He'd memorized every turn, every junction, every potential ambush point. While others were blinded by smoke and fear, he navigated with the confidence of a predator in its natural habitat. "Sir, please." The mercenary's voice was closer now. "The primary exit is still clear, but—" "Shut up!" Malachi snapped. "Get those lights working. Get me eyes on—" Kestrel emerged from the smoke like a ghost, his wheelchair silent as death. The first mercenary went down before he could raise his weapon, a blade finding the gap in his body armor. The second managed to fire once, a wild shot that echoed deafeningly in the confined space, before Kestrel's next strike silenced him permanently. Malachi stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief as the smoke parted to reveal his attacker. For all his bravado, for all his power and territory, he'd never actually seen Kestrel in action. The reality was far more terrifying than any rumors. "You," Malachi managed, his hand moving toward his waistband. "You're really what?" Kestrel's voice was cold, mechanical. "Really crippled? Really deadly? Really the ghost that's been haunting your empire?" His wheelchair moved forward slowly, deliberately. "I'm all of those things, Malachi. And more." Malachi drew his pistol with surprising speed, but Kestrel was already moving. The wheelchair spun with practiced precision, a blade extending from its frame to slash Malachi's hand. The gun clattered to the ground as the gang leader stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding fingers. "Your men broke Mrs. Chen's fingers," Kestrel stated, advancing steadily. "3 of them, for money she'd earned honestly. How many fingers should I take from you?" "Wait!" Malachi's back hit the tunnel wall. "Look, we can make a deal. Whatever they're paying you—" "Paying me?" Kestrel's laugh was empty of humor. "You still don't understand. This isn't about money, this is about consequences." A distant explosion rocked the tunnel, one of the demolition charges detonating early. Dust and concrete fragments rained down from the ceiling. They were running out of time. "You had a choice," Kestrel continued, inexorably closing the distance. "You could have been content with your territory, could have run your operation without terrorizing innocents, without breaking old women's fingers, without pushing someone like me to come out of retirement." "Please," Malachi's voice cracked, all his power, all his authority stripped away, leaving nothing but fear. "I have money, connections, I can..." "Can what? Buy your way out, like you always have?" Kestrel's wheelchair stopped inches from Malachi. "But that's not how this works. Not anymore." Another explosion, closer this time. The tunnel groaned ominously above them. "The charges will bring down this entire section in approximately 3 minutes," Kestrel informed him calmly. "The exits are sealed. The tunnels are filling with smoke. Your men are shooting at each other in the dark." He leaned forward slightly. "How does it feel, Malachi? To be truly helpless? To know that all your power, all your money, all your connections mean nothing?" Malachi tried to run, but Kestrel's chair moved with impossible speed, cutting off his escape. A blade pressed against the gang leader's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "Please," Malachi whispered. "I'll leave. I'll never come back. The territory is yours." "The territory?" Kestrel's voice carried genuine surprise. "You still think this is about territory?" The blade pressed slightly deeper. "This was never about territory. This was about justice, about consequences, about showing men like you that there are lines you don't cross." The tunnel shuddered again. Time was almost up. "So what happens now?" Malachi asked, his voice small and broken. "You kill me?" Kestrel held the blade steady, considering. In his former life, the decision would have been automatic, clean, final. But now... "No," he said finally, withdrawing the blade. "Death would be too easy. Instead, you're going to live. Live with the knowledge that everything you built was destroyed not by an army, not by a rival gang, but by a man in a wheelchair. Live with the humiliation of knowing that all your power meant nothing against someone you thought was helpless." The next explosion was the closest yet. The tunnel ceiling began to crack. "You have about 90 seconds to reach the south exit," Kestrel informed him, already wheeling backward into the smoke. "I'd run if I were you. And Malachi?" He paused, his silhouette barely visible in the chaos. "If you ever return to Cindermere District, if you ever harm another innocent person in my territory, our next meeting won't end with you walking away." As Kestrel disappeared into the smoke, Malachi stood frozen for a precious moment before self-preservation kicked in. He ran, stumbling through the collapsing tunnels, his empire literally crumbling around him. Behind him, in the darkness, a predator smiled grimly and began his own carefully planned escape. The real work was just beginning. Dawn broke over Cindermere District to the sound of sirens and the sight of smoke rising from multiple locations where the underground tunnel network had collapsed. Emergency vehicles crowded the streets while residents gathered in small groups, watching as their neighborhood became the focus of the city's attention. Kestrel observed it all from his apartment window, his body aching from the night's exertion. The evidence he'd gathered was already on its way to select journalists and law enforcement officials, enough to ensure Malachi's operation wouldn't simply relocate and rebuild. "They're saying it was a gas line explosion," Larissa said, entering without knocking. She carried 2 cups of coffee, placing one beside him. "The official story is already being constructed. Urban infrastructure failure, they're calling it." "Convenient," Kestrel replied, noting how the mercenaries had vanished like morning mist. Professionals knew when a contract wasn't worth dying for. "And Malachi?" "Gone. Some of the local kids saw him leaving the district just before dawn. He looked different, scared." She paused, studying Kestrel's profile. "What did you do to him down there?" "Gave him something worse than death." Kestrel took a sip of coffee. "Gave him perspective." Below, emergency workers were setting up barriers around the areas where the tunnels had collapsed. News vans were arriving, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. The neighborhood's secrets were surfacing, quite literally, from underground. "Mrs. Chen asked about you," Larissa continued, settling into the chair across from him. "She wanted to know if you needed more tea." A pause. "I think that's her way of checking if you're still. You..." Kestrel turned his wheelchair to face her. "And am I?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Are you?" "Last night, when everything was happening, the explosions, the screams, it felt like the neighborhood was at war. And somewhere in that chaos was you doing things that..." She trailed off. "That the quiet man in 4B shouldn't be capable of," he finished for her. "That no one should be capable of," she corrected. "The police found bodies in those tunnels, Kestrel. Professional soldiers, gang members. Casualties of their own choices," he said quietly. "Every man down there knew the risks they were taking, the side they'd chosen." A knock at the door interrupted them. Through the peephole, Kestrel saw Mrs. Chen clutching a familiar paper bag. He let her in, noting how she carried herself with renewed confidence despite her still bandaged hand. "Green tea," she announced, placing the bag on the table. "Good for healing, good for..." reflection. Her sharp eyes took in his appearance, noting the subtle signs of the previous night's activities that most would miss. "The neighborhood is talking. About changes. About what happened underground." "Let them talk," Kestrel replied. "Sometimes shadows need light to be properly understood." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "The men who hurt me, who took our money, they ran away this morning, like rats from a sinking ship." A small, satisfied smile crossed her face. "It is good to see rats run sometimes." "They'll try to come back," Larissa warned. "Other gangs hearing about a power vacuum." "No," Kestrel cut her off. "They won't." He wheeled to his desk, retrieving a USB drive. "This contains evidence of corruption reaching into every major criminal organization in the city. By tonight, it will be in the hands of people who can't be bought or threatened. The fallout will keep everyone too busy to think about Cindermere District." Mrs. Chen's eyes gleamed with understanding. Not just destroying the nest, but poisoning it so nothing can live there again. Clever. "But what about you?" Larissa asked. "After what happened, can you go back to being just the quiet man in the wheelchair? The one who fixes toys and helps with groceries?" Kestrel was silent for a moment, considering. The events of the past weeks had awakened something in him. Not just the operative he used to be, but something new. A protector rather than just a predator. Someone who used his skills not for governments or agencies, but for people who needed justice. "Maybe," he said finally, "I can be both. The neighborhood still needs someone to fix toys and help with groceries, but it also needs someone to ensure that what happened with Malachi never happens again. A guardian, Mrs. Chen suggested, but one who lives in shadows. The shadows are familiar territory, Kestrel agreed, and sometimes the best way to protect the light is from the darkness. Outside, the emergency vehicles were beginning to disperse. The immediate crisis was over, but the real changes were just beginning. News reports would soon expose the corruption Kestrel had uncovered. Investigations would be launched. The power structures that had allowed Malachi's operation to flourish would be dismantled. "I should check on my students," Larissa said, standing. "They'll have questions about all this." "Tell them the truth," Kestrel suggested. "That sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. That being vulnerable doesn't mean being helpless." After they left, Kestrel returned to his window vigil. The neighborhood was different now. Not just physically with its collapsed tunnels and emergency barriers, but fundamentally. The people walked differently, held themselves differently. Fear had been replaced by something else. Hope, perhaps, or the knowledge that they weren't alone. In his reflection on the window glass, Kestrel saw both versions of himself, the quiet neighbor and the deadly operative, merging into something new. Someone who could live in both worlds, who could be both protector and predator. The weight of this dual existence would be heavy, but as he watched his neighbors rebuilding their lives below, he knew it was a weight he was willing to bear. 1 month after the tunnel collapse, Cindermere District had begun to heal. The physical scars remained, patches of fresh concrete marking where the underground network had been sealed, repairs still ongoing in certain sections, but the neighborhood's spirit had transformed entirely. Kestrel watched from his usual spot by the window as children played freely in the streets again, their laughter carrying up to his apartment. Mrs. Chen's shop had reopened, now becoming a gathering place for residents who shared news and built stronger community bonds. The fear that had once permeated every corner of the district had been replaced by something stronger: unity. "The community center is full again," Larissa reported during one of her regular visits. "Parents aren't afraid to let their kids stay for after-school programs anymore. Even the older residents are coming out more, starting a neighborhood watch program." She smiled. "They're calling it Guardian Angels." "Fitting," Kestrel replied, thinking of the underground battle that had changed everything. "Though I doubt they're looking for the kind of guardian I became." "Maybe that's exactly what they're looking for," she countered. "Someone who proves that appearances can be deceiving, that strength comes in many forms." The evidence he'd gathered had done its work. News channels were still reporting on the widespread corruption he'd exposed. Several high-ranking officials had been arrested, and investigations were ongoing. Malachi had disappeared completely. Rumors suggested he'd fled the country, his empire not just destroyed, but erased. But more importantly, other criminal organizations had gotten the message. Cindermere District was no longer seen as easy territory. The wheelchair-bound vigilante had become an urban legend, a warning to those who would prey on the vulnerable. "You've started something," Mrs. Chen told him one evening, bringing her customary tea. "Not just here, but in other neighborhoods too. People are standing up, refusing to pay protection money, reporting crimes without fear." "They always had that strength," Kestrel observed. "They just needed to be reminded of it." His own transformation had been equally profound. The skills and instincts of his former life no longer felt like a burden to be suppressed, but rather a tool to be used wisely. He still fixed children's toys and helped with groceries, but now he also kept watch, maintaining the peace he'd fought to establish. The wheelchair that had once felt like a prison now served as perfect cover. Who would suspect that the quiet man in 4B, who needed help reaching high shelves, was the same shadow that kept the district's darker elements at bay? "You know," Larissa said one day, watching him repair a broken remote control car for one of the neighborhood kids, "some people say there's a guardian angel watching over Cindermere District, someone who protects us from the shadows." "People need their myths," Kestrel replied, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "They're symbols of hope." "And what do you need?" she asked, studying him carefully. Kestrel paused in his work, considering. "This," he said finally. A purpose that uses all of who I am, not just the parts that fit what others expect. The district had changed, and so had he. The line between his two selves, the quiet neighbor and the deadly operative, had blurred into something new. Someone who could live in the light while working in shadows, who could be both protector and predator as circumstances required. As dusk settled over Cindermere District, Kestrel prepared for his evening patrol. His wheelchair, still modified with its hidden weapons and tactical improvements, moved silently through the familiar streets. Residents nodded to him, some knowing, others simply greeting the helpful man from Wraith's Edge. The night belonged to him now, not to those who would do harm. His presence, whether seen or unseen, ensured that the peace would last. Not through fear, as Malachi had attempted, but through the understanding that justice could come from the most unexpected sources. The neighborhood needs both versions of you, Larissa had told him once. The man who fixes toys and the one who fixes bigger problems. They're both real, both necessary. Essie was right. In finding his true purpose, Kestrel had also found a way to reconcile his past with his present. The skills that had once made him a perfect weapon could also make him a perfect guardian. As he made his rounds, watching over the community that had become his home, Kestrel reflected on the strange path that had led him here. Sometimes the greatest strengths come from what others perceive as weaknesses. Sometimes the most effective guardians are those that others underestimate. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the urban jungle is the quiet man in the wheelchair, who serves as a reminder that justice can come from the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.